I'm James Foster, and if you were here this morning, I started off the event. It's great to be here with you today on this sunny day. We can look out the window and imagine what it's like. But today I want to introduce my co-author, Sabina Alkire, who has been in a space that we talked about quite a lot during this conference already. What does it mean for a country to be advanced? Does it mean just having enough income floating around somewhere? Maybe not that person, but that person has it. Does it mean that we're healthy? That we're educated? That we have access to social services? What does it really mean? And so Professor Alkire from Oxford University has spent decades thinking deeply about that issue. You may have seen some of the results of her work in the Gross National Happiness Index of Bhutan, which she was an advisor on the creation of this, but also more fundamental discussions of the capability approach of Amartya Sen, trying to understand what freedom really means and how to value it. But in any case, today she'll talk about the natural progression of this, discussing what it means to be poor, not to have enough. And what's the progress like in India recently, over the last several decades? So to hear about that, we have the world's expert with us, Sabina Alkire.
Thank you, James. It's lovely to be here, and I look forward very much to interactions and to discussions. I will just briefly present some results, first showing India's levels of poverty in comparison to other countries, and then looking within India and over time to take a deeper look. And this session draws on work that's jointly done with UNDP and launched every year as a global multidimensional poverty index. The methodology that underlies it is something that I've co-authored with James Foster, which really extends his work over many decades in the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke measure of monetary poverty, which is the most widely implemented measure of poverty unidimensionally. And a multidimensional poverty index extends it by looking at a set of indicators. In the case of the global MPI, which I am presenting, it is 10 indicators. And a poverty measure, of course, wants to identify who is poor. So you look at these 10 indicators, not for a country, but for each person or for each household. So for example, you are deprived in nutrition if anybody in your household is undernourished. An adult with a body mass index under the age BMI body mass index specification, or a child who is stunted or underweight. You're deprived in child mortality if, very sadly, a child under the age of 18 has died in the last 5 years in your household. You're deprived in years of schooling if nobody in your household has completed 6 years of schooling. No one. You're deprived in school attendance if any child in your household is not attending school up to the age at which they should complete class 8. You're deprived if you have solid cooking fuel like wood or dung or charcoal that creates air pollution, acute respiratory infections, and eye problems. You're deprived if you lack adequate sanitation or share it with other families. If you don't have safe drinking water, not even on your premises, but within a 30-minute walk round trip. You're deprived if you don't have access to electricity, or if the roof, wall, and floors of your house are made of suboptimal materia, or kacha. And you're deprived if you don't have more than one of a set of small assets: a radio, a telephone, a television, an animal cart, a computer, a refrigerator, a bicycle, or a motorcycle. You can have one of those, but if you have 2 of those, you're not deprived. So what a multidimensional poverty measure does is it looks at all of these indicators for each person and it adds them up. They cover 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards that are equally weighted. So the health and education indicators weigh a bit more because there's fewer of them. And so each person obtains a score that says what percentage of possible deprivations do they face. The picture shows a case study from one of the islands of Bangladesh, and this wonderful grandmother who lives with her husband and granddaughter was deprived in 44.4% of the deprivations. And as I said, any poverty measure identifies who's poor. How many people in this room are poor? So in the case of the global MPI, you are identified as poor if you experience 1/3 or more of the possible deprivations. A single one won't do. You have to have at least 1/3. Deepa has 44%. That's more than 1/3. So she is poor. So that's how each person is identified as multidimensionally poor. And there's one more step. With this step, you know what percentage of the population are poor, but you don't know how poor they are or what indicators they are deprived in. We call that intensity. So Deepa, her score is 44%. The average deprivation score among the poor is called the intensity. And when you multiply two numbers together, the percentage of people who are poor and the average deprivation score of the poor, you get a simple measure, a Foster-Greer-Thorbecke style multidimensional measure that you can disaggregate by population groups. But the interesting thing for policy is you can break it apart by indicator. So you know how many people are deprived and poor in each of the 10 indicators. And if any of the deprivations of any poor people go down, poverty goes down. So that's the methodology. Are you with me? Okay. So what happens in the case of India? In terms of the global stage, we computed last year for 110 countries, 6.1 billion people. And we use DHS, which is the NFHS 5 in India, as well as mix and national data sets. And across those 6.1 billion people, 1.1 billion were multidimensionally poor in 2023. And half of those 1.1 billion poor people are children under the age of 18. 2/3 nearly live in middle income countries, not in low income countries, 730 million people. And most of them, 83%, live in either sub-Saharan Africa, nearly half, or South Asia, nearly one, or just over 1/3. But the data in South Asia are newer by 2.5 years than the data in sub-Saharan Africa. So we might have better progress shortly. Now, one finding that took the headlines in the case of India is that in the 15-year period between 2005-06 with the NFHS 3 dataset and 2019 to 21, the most recent NFHS 5 dataset, 415 million people left poverty, 275 million in the first decade. That's a number of the same magnitude as the decadal improvements of monetary poverty in China. We all know that China reduced monetary poverty very strongly, and because of that, the world met the MDG on monetary poverty. And within a decade, China got around 268 million people out of poverty. So India's reduction was momentous on a global stage as well as nationally. The percentage of people who are poor declined from 55%, more than half the population, in 2005-06, to 16.4% in 2019 to 21. That's not post-pandemic. 71% of the interviews were taken before the pandemic. All 10 of the MPI indicators had a statistically significant reduction. And so that is important also because the Sustainable Development Goals, which apply to all countries, call on countries to cut their headcount ratio of MPI by 1/2 within 15 years. Well, this is 15 years. India cut it from 55% to 16%, well more than half. India is a big country, the biggest of the countries with global MPI. So it shows that it's possible. It's a sign of hope for other countries. Furthermore, the Sustainable Development Goals and our ethical motivations want to look at the poorest. One way of doing so is to look at levels of poverty by states in India. This data set also goes down to the district level. But if we look at the states, the poorest states are on the right, Bihar, Jharkhand, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, because this is the level of poverty and this is high poverty. It's a race to zero poverty. So the states that are winning the race are closest to the bottom. So this is a happy slide. Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, they have the fastest absolute reduction of multidimensional poverty. That means they're not being left behind. They're catching up in absolute terms. For example, Bihar had 77% of its people in poverty in 2005-06 and 35% in 2019 to 21. This is not a given. We have trends for 84 countries, and in many cases, the pace of poverty reduction is slower, and the trends of subnational regions are not pro-poorest. So Indonesia is pro-poorest, Nepal is. There are countries that are, Bangladesh, but many others are not. How each state reduced poverty, of course, varied depending on their initial conditions, depending on the state level emphases. For example, Bihar here had a very strong reduction in electricity. Many of them had strong reductions in cooking fuel, this green one. But the levels of decrease in nutrition and child mortality varied quite a bit. And there's a lot to learn from that because we can learn from what went well in certain states and use it prospectively to inform actions in the next period. I will not talk about this, but there's some differences between the MPI and the incidence of poverty. But if we look at the MPI, this is where we're seeing the strongest and most accurate portrayal because it includes how poor people reduce their deprivations even if they remain poor. And so this is where these states have a priority, but it's very, very similar across the different measures. So I've showed you states, what happened in rural areas where 90% of the poor people in India live in 2019 to 21. They had a faster absolute reduction than urban areas, which is a positive thing. The number of poor people decreased from 557 million to 207 million in rural areas. And all 10 indicators had a reduction. So you can see whether it's urban or rural, there's reductions across the 3 periods in all indicators. Another interesting group are children, age cohorts. And we look at all the age cohorts, but for simplicity, I'm going to compare children who are the poorest in India as they are globally with adults. All of the age groups had significant decreases in both periods, but children did very well. So there were 297 poor children in 2005-06, and it reduced by 199 million poor children to 98, which is a very positive reduction in the time period and faster than the reduction of adults. And again, you can see that across both of these groups, every indicator reduced statistically significantly. And children went one step further in that their reduction was so fast that whereas globally half of the poor people are children, in 2005-06 in India was 46%, and now it's come down to 42%. So children were a particular success because in many countries, nearly half of the countries we cover, children are left behind in other countries. This is something we need to learn about. So that's a brief on the international stage and just within India of changes over time. But in 2019 to 2021, there were still 229 million poor people in India, which is a big number. The country with the next largest number of poor people by the global MPI is Ethiopia with 97 million. India has 98 million poor children. So it's still very significant on the world stage. But at the present, as I said, 16% of people are poor, and the biggest deprivations are in nutrition, cooking fuel, and housing. So what is happening? So these are the level of incidence by state. And as you heard, it's about 35% of poor people in Bihar, coming down very low to 1% in Kerala. So the inequality across states remains very high. The intensity is here. And you also see that with the exception of Chandigarh, where there were some also problems with the survey, that the poorer the state, and this is a sad finding, the higher the intensity of poverty on average for every poor person in that state. The MPI makes that visible, and also makes visible its reduction. So that's an ongoing challenge, the inequality across states and the high levels of deprivations in the poorest states, meaning they will require more money to reduce their poverty. So what are the tools for policy action? The most important is to know what to do. So with the MPI, you can look at the number of poor people who are deprived in each indicator and multiply that by the weight, and you get the level of MPI here. And you can see, if you compare, for example, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, that the education deprivations, these mauve-colored ones in Uttar Pradesh, are much bigger. Nutritional deprivations are about the same, a little bit more child mortality. But Uttar Pradesh has almost no asset poverty, for example, and much less poverty in housing and electricity. So there are significant differences across the states, as you can see, and these are really useful when state chief ministers want to really plan what to do. When you go down to the district level, again, with standard errors and considering them, you still have information on district level priorities. These are not in the Global MPI report. They are in India's official national multidimensional poverty report, which adds 2 indicators to the Global MPI. Again, at the present, children remain a priority group, with nearly 22% of children being poor, as opposed to about 14% of adults. Another policy piece is to look at the deprivations that walk together. We can do this globally, but we can do this for India. And this is an interesting slide because it looks at the most common sets of indicators that walk together. And in India, it's nutrition, housing, sanitation, and cooking fuel. And if you look at all of the schemes, midday cooked meals or sanitation or whatever, there's not a scheme that addresses all of these together. And so it might be an interesting challenge, because 15% of the poor, 34 million people, only have those 4 deprivations. So the MPI adds some evidence that can help people to respond cost effectively in times whether or not growth is strong. And a good news story before we conclude with the current briefing on India is that this is the deprivation score of the poor in 2019 to 21. Remember, the cutoff, the poverty line, is at 33%. Well, more than half of the poor people, 61%, are just below the poverty line. So it could be possible that in the next period, India would continue to see a fast reduction. However, we don't want any government to pick the least poor. We want to leave no one behind. And so also to invest in these people who have over 70% of the deprivations. And so we want to see the pro-poorest trends, but this is a sign that in the next period, we are hoping against hope, although these data are pre-COVID, so there will be a shock that will be invisible between the next 2 data sets. We are hoping for a strong reduction. There's some technical notes I can answer, but I won't present those. I wanted to close by simply showing a couple of the next steps, because they might link a little bit to the morning sessions. So for geeks in the room, I don't know if anybody uses Stata, but we have Stata programs and Stata toolbox to do very large analyses, because the India file is quite big with 2.8 million people. And so running it efficiently on your laptop, you need some really good programming. So that's a free resource. But the most important is to say, why did poverty go down? What was the role that economic growth played? What about public expenditure? What about social movements? What about migration of peoples, etc.? We've done a little bit of work, and it's not really solved the mystery, which is why this is a call. And it's a call also for sharing data. so that we can look nationally at all of the different schemes, which vary so much by state. But with Shuman Shet, a student of Professor Foster's, and using a growth elasticity measure that James Foster created, we did an analysis across the states of India and of other South Asian countries to see the role that measured growth played in poverty reduction. And to make a long story short, it's not been a major role. So we've looked very closely at the state level with the state GDP figures, with different measures of growth over time, with different lag periods. And that's not going to solve our mystery. So we need to go deeper and have a much more nuanced analysis. We can go deeper within the household because for nutrition, we have individual data for women, men, and children. For years of schooling and for school attendance, we have individual level data. And that enables us to look at gender. For example, in India, slightly more girls, 6.8% of girls are poor and out of school versus 6.1% of boys. But the difference is statistically significant. Whereas there's no difference, very happily, between the children who are undernourished in India, although sadly, the percentage is much higher of children 0 to 4. And we can also look at intra-household inequalities. 1 in 12 girls or boys lives in a household where another school-aged child is going to school, but I'm not going to school. So these are inequalities at the household level that need to be addressed because it means the household could send somebody to school, but wasn't sending everybody. And of course, we can overlay this with environmental variables to look at forest loss, at steepness of the slope, at rain cover, at floods, at air particulate matter, at wildfires, earthquakes, and other disasters using the satellite data to look at people who are both themselves multidimensionally poor and living geographically in districts or parts of districts that are particularly vulnerable to environmental events in the same time period that they are poor. So those are possible. So I think I will stop there. My 20 minutes are here, and I really look forward to your suggestions, how to improve, how to go further. The next phase is really vital to continue this trend, to continue to reduce poverty after the pandemic with all of the migration that occurred, and to use data going forward to have a gendered and a moderate poverty measure for India. Thank you.
Efficient as usual, Sabina. Thank you so much. Now I will turn the podium over to Nandini Krishnan, who is here from the World Bank, lead economist for the South Asian region. Thank you for being here, and we anticipate your comments.
So thank you, everyone. It's great to be here on a lovely day and in this great venue. I had to just walk over a couple of blocks. So first, let me say that thank you, James, for inviting me. I got the opportunity to meet Sabina in person. We've been exchanging emails and phone calls for the last 2, 3, 4 years, maybe, and haven't met. But just to say, so first, the work that James and Sabina have done, work of OFEAT, needs no introduction. It's great to see how far the MPI has come as a globally accepted measure of deprivation and as a target for policymakers for improving well-being and thinking about it holistically, going beyond monetary poverty. And one of the nice features that Sabina mentioned was that it allows you to both look at the extensive margin of deprivation as well as the intensity of deprivation. And because of this, we have this great 15-year trend for India, which, India matters to the world for many reasons, but especially in this matter. And one of the things that I noticed was it's not only that India has lifted 400+ million people out of poverty over these 15 years, the pace of that reduction hasn't slowed down. So it's been some sort of 2 to 3 percentage points per year, and that is remarkable. And if you sort of dig a little bit deeper, you see what India's managed to do successfully. It's the poorest places, the most deprived groups that have been lifted the most, and it's come through progress in sort of some key features, which are going to be important in a second. So sanitation, cooking fuel, and housing. But if I can, there might be some cause for concern. So this is amazing, and laurels are deserved. But if I have to look forward for the next 15 years, there might be some things we need to think about more. I suspect that the next decade for progress will not be as easy as the past decade has been, because there's a need for a big push. Rural progress has been slower in relative terms. Female-headed households in India continue to have higher poverty rates than male-headed households. And deprivation in nutrition remains high, especially if you look at the uncensored deprivation rates. So that's one part of the challenge. The other part is that as you reduce poverty, there are challenges of reaching the last mile, the poorest of the poor, the people who are least integrated into systems, institutions, markets, communities. And that's where I think the future challenge lies. But let me take nutrition for a second. I think nutrition is an outcome that's a little bit different from some of the other indicators that go into the MPI, because it really is a composite outcome that requires concerted effort on a large number of dimensions. And so it is hard to bring down. And it's not something where, like the government has clearly done, has expanded access to cooking fuel, to sanitation, to clean water. And you see that clearly in the remarkable progress that's happened. But addressing child stunting, addressing nutrition requires a whole gamut of coordinated interventions that are harder to put together, harder to track, harder to measure, harder to do well. And India is not alone in this challenge. It's been a challenge for South Asia. Nepal has had a remarkable reduction in stunting. So maybe there is something to learn from what's happened there for a country where you may not expect it. But the other part of stunting that's important to remember is that it has generational consequences. So what you're trying to do is actually address accumulated deficits. And that's another, so it's not going to go away in a generation. You really have to work hard at it. And it matters because it matters so much for India's growth potential. If you want to think about India becoming the aspiration, a high-income country, if that high-income country doesn't have its productive potential unleashed, then it will be very difficult to achieve without carrying all these people, right? So that's on the sort of, the other sort of small note on caution is on vulnerability. So it's true that many people are close to the poverty line, but much of this data was collected right before the second wave of COVID in particular, which was particularly lethal in India. So we hope to see this progress replicated for the next 15 years, but I think just a note of caution is warranted there. So I think 3 points in terms of taking this work forward, and I think they're very much aligned with what Sabina presented in terms of future and ongoing work. So one is on the determinants of poverty reduction. This is something that is very close to my heart because we're also struggling with some of the same issues of how to unpack what's going on. And I think what's happened very well in India over the last 15 years is that India Stack has delivered a huge, there are new mechanisms for the government to reach people, which are being used widely. Direct benefit transfers, expansion in sort of social safety nets, and the coverage, especially in rural areas, is very high. And there's a huge proliferation of schemes at the central level, at the state level, right? But the data for all of this exists somewhat in silos. So there are dashboards for each scheme in different ministries that are tasked with implementing this, right? So how do we put it all together to understand what the impact is on outcomes like this, right? What was the role? And this is, I think, an important question the government is itself struggling to answer, because they want to be able to make the case that having made these investments, this is what they can show to it. And the challenge is that at the household level, for these surveys, we're not asking the questions about which schemes did you benefit from, which ones were you eligible for. And at the dashboard level, the monitoring level, a lot of the monitoring is happening still on the output level or the input level, not at the outcome level. And so putting this all together, and Sabina, your question on help us put this expenditure data, I guess we're also here for help. We don't know where the money is going, right? It's probably going to the right place, as all these trends show, but it would be amazing to have a survey that actually collects all of this information and puts it together so that the government can understand the effectiveness of this huge public investment that has been put in place. A second point is on inequality, and you clearly see that in the state level graphs, right? So in some ways, India is a story, Indian states are converging, in other ways they are diverging. Where the poor live is becoming increasingly concentrated, no matter which measure you use. But one sort of, and this issue of inequality is becoming more and more important. So consumption-based measures don't show much change at all in inequality. If you look at estimates that are out there on wealth inequality, these suggest that India's had a huge increase in inequality. So how does this pattern correlate with inequality in multidimensional deprivation? So for some indicators, you would expect that inequality, especially at the household income and expenditure level, shouldn't matter. Some of these are and can and should be state provided and are state provided. And that's the state sort of lifting all boats, and that's a good thing. But others rely on households' own ability to earn incomes, to reinvest those incomes, to send their kids to school, to improve learning outcomes, improve outcomes like nutrition. So one suggestion would be to at least look at household level inequality with the uncensored deprivation measure. So you could do that within districts. You'll have some districts which have lower MPI headcount rates versus others, but you can construct a sort of a Gini for it, or a measure of inequality. And that will help find out where you have not just people, sort of districts falling behind, but also districts where only a few are kind of driving the averages. And the final area that you also alluded to, Sabina, is on how does this relate to household and individual vulnerability to climate change? And again, this is sort of more of a selfish ask because we're also thinking about this. So if you think about what contributes to resilience or vulnerability to climate change, that is also a multidimensional, has to be a multidimensional measure, because there's lots of things that go into it. A lot of the human capital measures here contribute to resilience. Where people work, what they do for a livelihood, that also matters. If you're working in construction, if you're in agriculture, you're going to be exposed to heat, exposed to flooding, exposed to air pollution, right? So there's an inequality aspect in that too. How much of India can afford to have its livelihoods or their own sort of personal health and well-being protected from all of these climate risks? Not many can. Access to social protection, financial inclusion instruments, credit, all these matter for resilience. Better connectivity, resilient infrastructure, all of this matters. So measuring this will take a multidimensional approach. We're trying to do something like that at the World Bank as part of our new corporate scorecard. And I hope that we can learn and build on the great work that Ofi's already done on the multidimensional index. And I hope it's at least as useful. So thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Let's go on up here, and you're mic'd up already, so we can open the floor up in just 1 second, but let me ask one question to Sabina. So I've always wondered about this. You do remember that in the old days of the multidimensional poverty, when we were trying to convince people that this was indeed a way of thinking about poverty. Sen and Dres had a document which compared India's performance in these other dimensions to neighbors in the South Asia region. As I remember, it was rather. Now, how do you align that with the results that you've been seeing? And can you kind of elaborate on that for a sec?
Yes, in 2013, Amartya Sen and Jean Dres published a book called Uncertain Glory, India and Its Contradictions, where they looked at post-liberalization India after 1991. They looked at the growth trends, and then they compared the social indicators using the 2005-06 NFHS 3 data set. And India performed worse than Bangladesh, Nepal, the poorest of the South Asia countries, where at that point their GDP per capita was 1/2 that of India, but their social indicators were higher. and the progress they had had in the previous period in terms of improving social indicators was faster than India. And so in that period up to 2006, India was a laggard. So the data that I presented are the 2015 and the 2019-21 data. And so those came out after the book was published, and they have shown a different trend. And so that trend, so I remember I was motivated to look at this because, what was it, in 2002, 46% of children under the age of 5 were undernourished. And in 2006, 46% of children under the age of 4 were not, and it hadn't changed despite really good growth. And so that was one of the motivations to really look further at these direct deprivations. But yeah, there are changes, as Nandini said. There's still areas that need a lot of investment, including nutrition. But I think that there has been a change or a shift in some of the social trends.
Nandini, do you have anything to add to that? Or Sabina, do you have any remarks to Nandini before we open it to the audience?
I mean, I think I really wanted to underscore what Nandini said. Sorry to be geeky about nutrition, but of the 16.4% of people who are poor in India, a lot of them are deprived in nutrition, right? But 17% of people who are not poor are vulnerable, just above the poverty line, and also deprived in nutrition. And in India, 7.2% of people are not poor, not vulnerable, but still deprived in nutrition. So nutrition has come down strongly from 56% to 37% as a proportion of the society. But in the most recent period, there's still 7% of people who are not poor, not vulnerable, but deprived in nutrition. Why is that? It has to do with the feeding of colostrum, the neonatal period. It has to do with weaning, not introducing enough soft food. And so things that knowledge can change, as well as expectations about what a healthy baby looks like. And so there are aspects of information that perhaps could complement other kinds of programs. And I think that just really a whole joined up approach is very necessary, and the data are very showing that. It's not the same in other regions of the world, because we can always look and see how many people are not poor but deprived in nutrition. And it's really a South Asian phenomenon with a couple other outliers in other countries like Yemen, but not really to the same extent in any other world region.
All right, folks, it's up to you. I saw one hand go up, and I know you've been commenting a lot, but please comment more. Yes.
The 3 precise questions. You have used 15 indicators. They're excellent, outstanding, which I can connect across through various sessions of the day. My first question is, compare India with China and focus on the key differences, not on nutrition, but on access to education, access to electricity. Are they the widest India-China comparison? Second question is, can these MPI indicators be also used to measure the rise of the middle class, the lower middle class? Your 400 million people exactly match the rise of the middle class in India that we have derived. And there are 400 million people who have registered car users. So it fits in very well. The third question is, will this explain why the manufacturing sector is so small in India? Only 20% of energy needed by industries are currently met in India, either energy produced by clean or dirty, only 20%. 80% have no access. So will this also spill over into the manufacturing sector?
So right over here. And we'll take 3 questions, if you can remember and write them down. Right over here, actually. Yes, indeed. Great.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. I really appreciate both your contributions so much. I had a quick thought when you were mentioning, how food supply, food famine, that's really kind of rising significantly around the world, much more in other countries than India, but certainly in India as well, right? Recently, I think India stopped doing sugar exports suddenly. Also before that, I think rice was reduced. Climate change is factoring into it, the local soil, agriculture, a lot of these different elements. And I'm just curious to know how your study or other studies that you're aware of are kind of tracking some of these new evolving, rapidly evolving spaces, not just for India, but for all the groups that you do cover. Thank you.
Great. And on the table back there, we have a gentleman eating lunch and
I had
asking
my
questions.
lunch. Sanjay Kathuria. Hi, Nandini. Two very short questions. One is that, is there a correlation that might be stronger between your multi-dimensional poverty index and a more ambitious measure of the poverty line, like a middle income poverty line or upper middle? Is there a better correlation between that measure? And the second question is about stunting. Why is it so stubborn? I understand the latest figure for is 25, 27% or something in India, and something similar, or even more actually, maybe in the 30s, right? Why is it so stubborn even across the income, different deciles? So that's good.
Sabina.
Thank you. And I think Nandini can probably add things as well. In terms of the comparison with China, so in China, for the global MPI, we use the CFPS, the China Family Panel Study. And unfortunately, we don't have data for China after 2014. And in 2014, only 4.1% of people are poor. So we only have data back. We don't have data back to when China had a parallel trajectory to India. So we can't do a serious comparison, which is unfortunate because, of course, we would very much wish to look at the historical trends of China. So we are trying to find out ways of working with partners to go back in time. But unfortunately, right now, in the publicly available data, we're not able to do that. In terms of the middle class, Luis Felipe Lopez Calvo, actually, at the World Bank, had done a three-tier poverty measure where one was poverty, one was a middle class measure. And we have not done that for India, but I think it would be very important. In terms of what you said, what is correct is that the number of vulnerable people, the percentage, has been steady and poverty has declined, which does mean that 415 million people are neither poor nor vulnerable. And so I know that if we were to measure it, they would have appeared above the vulnerable class. We see in other countries that poverty goes down, but the vulnerable people right above the poverty increase. So I'm happy that hasn't happened in India. It hasn't gone down, and it increased a little bit for children. But by and large, as a nation, there's not been a statistically significant change, which is good. And then in terms of the access, I think others would answer that better than I. I don't have enough information. And similarly, in terms of the exports and the evolving processes, I think that's one area where we as a research group sort of need friends, because we work so much on measurement that we need to partner with other groups that really can bring new angles of analysis, new research questions, new data, because that's really important, but we can't do it ourselves. And in terms of Sanjay's questions, we all know the issues with Indian monetary poverty right now. And so what I can say is more generally, there are two kinds of countries, one where we have multidimensional and monetary from the same data set, so we can look very intimately at who's deprived in both, and the other where we just look at trends of national measures. Where we look at both, we find exactly what you say. The correlation is actually lowest among the severely poor in monetary and multidimensional terms. And as you go up to middle, obviously more of the population are involved, but the correlation, the association gets higher. It's never very high, usually over half of the poor by one measure are not half by the other, but it's still better, as it were, when the poverty lines are, as you said, a more moderate poverty line. And in terms of stunting and why it is so difficult, I think it was 27% in 2015, so I think it's lower now, but I don't remember exactly the number. When we look across countries, because we have these data, we don't have stunting for about 12 countries, I think, of the 110, but we do have them for the rest. And we have trends for more than 70 countries. And we do see reductions and sometimes speedy ones. And so I think our emphasis has been to learn to point out and to learn from the places that we're able to reduce stunting and nutrition quickly and in a sustainable way, that it didn't go up later. And so those are the ones to profile. Because it's not stubborn everywhere, but if it is Indonesia, if it is Sri Lanka, if it is India, then it is a more stubborn figure.
Nandini.
I'll try. None of these are my subject matter area of expertise, but so don't quote me on anything. But so just a couple of points that came up on India's sort of food policy. So we've obviously had a very successful food and agricultural policy that was tailored towards food security. And that goal has largely been met. And I think that this probably is the right time to think about what it means to have a policy for a changing climate, for improving nutrition. So, and there's pros and cons to putting export bans, but there's clearly there was a rationale for that. But then you could argue that farmers didn't get the gains they could have. So there's pros and cons to that. That's way beyond my pay grade to comment on. On stunting, again, I'm not an expert on this. I've been trying to educate myself. Apparently, most of the damage is done before you're the age of 2. So that means that if you're doing midday meal schemes, right, that's helping children probably improve their attention in school, not be hungry, helping parents send kids to school, but it's not addressing stunting. That damage is already done. So it requires a different set of interventions. And from what I know, from where careful work has been done, I don't think it's been done that carefully in India, because you cannot even just say, I've done this at the national level. It probably needs really careful state level analysis. In Pakistan, what they found, where the bank has done a lot of work, was that it was a combination of some of the things Sabina meant, but also a lot of contamination between water, sanitation, so fecal contamination, animal-based contamination. So that, you can have the best nutrition and the best sort of early childhood care, but you're still sort of having contaminated water, which is reducing the child's ability to grow and learn. And it has really damaging long-term effects cognitively, right? So it's not just about you being short. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. Again, not an expert. So I think there's a need for careful work to understand what's happening, and to what extent it is, so in Nepal, the largest declines have happened in Karnali and Sudar Pashchim, which are the most mountainous provinces. And so perhaps what's happened there is you have communities, and I'm speculating, but it's a hypothesis if anyone wants a research topic, they've had a massive reduction in stunting. So in the winter months, they're cut off. So they're eating basically whatever grain you can store, potatoes and preserved greens, pickles, that's it, right? So if you have better connectivity to the rest of the economy, suddenly you have access to more information, better health services, better education, and different types of food. And maybe that's what's going on, and maybe water contamination is not an issue. But in Madhesh, which is another Nepali province, which is on the border with UP and Bihar, you probably have contamination because you have a water contamination because you have a low water table, and you have lots of cultivation, and you have animals, and you have a much more densely populated. So I think those issues are probably more similar to what's happening in UP and Bihar. But again, not my area of expertise, but I have lots of opinions on it.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Now we're going to go with another question right up front here and in the back there second, and we'll have a third one in the, I'm sorry that, Ajay, you just 5 minutes. I know we have 5 minutes.
Okay.
1 minute question, please.
So
1 minute.
quick question. So I was struck by when in your presentation, Sabrina, about the divergence within the Hindi belt, right? So there's a sort of way of looking. Traditionally, the Bimaru states, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, we all often are clubbed together. But what you seem to be seeing is not just that poverty is being reduced, but it seems to be being reduced in different ways. So that's the first. And if there's time for a second, very quickly, how would you place what's happening in India in perspective, in a larger South Asian perspective, particularly in comparison with Pakistan and Bangladesh?
Great. Matt, take it to someone in the back with their hands up.
Thank you. I'll be quick. My name is Amit Mukherjee, affiliated with my wife. We were both from the
That's
World Bank
excellent.
recently.
We're
Sabina,
very
thank
happy.
you, and Nandini, good to see you again. Quick questions. Number one, I don't think just micro and macro data are enough anymore when you talk about India and talk about inequality and poverty. Why is it that there seems to be persistent and deep pockets of poverty along certain lines in India? Whether it's the so-called Naxalite belt down the spine of India or other pockets, what explains these differences? And what explains the huge variance in states' performance and districts' performance in addressing these issues? Because I think You see very wide variations even within states. How would you address these questions, and what other data would you need to be able to address them better?
Thank you very much. And then right over here, there was someone who held his hand up there very quickly. And so well, you fight amongst yourselves. I'll turn around.
Thank you. I'll make it very quick. We spoke about having data in silos in Nandini's speech up there. And do you think with the current tools that are available to us, that is India Stack and Jan Dhan Yojana, do you think having a separate implementation agency in India to implement these new schemes that the governments come up with would help not having data in silos and have it in a more centralized manner?
Okay, we'll stop there and then I'll turn it over to Sabina.
Agricultural economist, and she has written on all of these topics being discussed.
Well, you make sure that you correct every single person if there's a problem, okay? No, it's no trouble.
And yours.
India is so rich in data, but one of the questions is, what impact is your work having in the way they are looking at existing data sets to influence policy?
Well, thank you so much for that. And now I'll turn it over to Sabina, please.
Mindful of Ajay, I'll be very, very quick and probably won't cover everything. In terms of India and other countries, so Bangladesh has had a very strong reduction. Nepal has had a very strong reduction. Pakistan has not, very sadly. It's had a statistically significant reduction led by Punjab, but not even mirrored significantly by other provinces. Bhutan is, Maldives and Sri Lanka are so much less poor that comparisons are difficult. But it does seem to be that there's very strong progress in South Asia globally. In terms of data, we do at the national level, we've mentioned the decompositions by scheduled tribe, scheduled caste, by religion. So the Muslims are the poorest and they have the fastest reduction in both periods. The STs are the poorest, fastest reduction in both periods. But when you drill down and you look within states, obviously it varies because how these groups are within states vary. But also whether the poorest group has reductions does vary across states. So with Christian Olvigas, we're doing a paper on that. And in terms of the why, we don't know. We're just at the moment trying to describe it, look at standard errors, look at what we can do as far as we can with the data. And in terms of a separate agency to implement, that is something that Colombia did, for example, under President Santos, because he recognized he could not bring peace without addressing poverty. He set up DPS, the Department of Social Prosperity, as a separate agency, and it was charged with overseeing and coordinating the 9 ministries that worked on schemes associated with poverty. There was a presidential lead. He attended every meeting. The ministers could not send deputies, and they sort of had a profile. Am I supposed to be quiet?
No, I'm describing the picture of the ministers here, and here's the president.
Okay.
And yeah, continue.
But it was a good way to make visible, I think, some of the work. And in terms of Umalele, I'm certainly an admirer of your work. Niti Aayog in the current government has developed and released an official multidimensional poverty index that includes maternal health in the health dimension and includes bank account in the living standard dimension. And they're yeah, and it's included in the Niti Aayog measure. So what they've done is they've released this down to the district level, and we are hoping there are some states where they have had workshops and engagements on it. So we're hoping to see more engagement.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. And I just want to add one sentence if you have something to say, Nandini, and otherwise we'll just.
Not known for one sentences, but I can speak really fast.
Okay,
So
I want to
very quickly.
very, very quick, and
Yeah.
otherwise Ajay's
So-
come in and beat us up.
State capacity matters, district capacity certainly matters. You see that in every indicator you look at India. State lines matter, and district matters because you know, where the state appoints the good district collectors, you will see the amount of money they're controlling, the amount of implementation they're doing. They're little countries in themselves, so that matters. In terms of data, India is both data rich and data poor. So we have a lot of new types of data that are not being used the way they should be. But the data gap that I was referencing is the ability to take a household survey where you're measuring outcomes for a household and link that with the specific schemes and benefits that the government is putting. And that is important both for fiscal responsibility, for the efficiency of public resources, but also if India has a fiscal crisis, let's say the sort of big floods that happened in Pakistan, and you need to know where to withdraw money from. You won't know because there's money is rightly being spent and delivered to the bottom of the distribution, but you won't know what to cut back on because you could do harm. And so, and the government is aware of this, and I think this is the next step for India to take after the sort of big expansion, is creating a data ecosystem that accompanies that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that ends our session. We'll begin the next one.